So Sweden is ranked as the fourth most equal country in the world, but we still have our challenges. And one of these challenges are perception of safety and crime. And as Cornelis talked about the situational perspective, we often look at crime as from the place-based perspective, analyzing places. And when we do that, we can often see that crime and perception of safety is closely connected to place. And we have some statistics in Sweden showing this. And what's interesting is that there are different patterns for the sexes. And I think that a lot of you can relate to this. So these statistics in Sweden show that 38% of Swedish women feel unsafe in their neighborhood at nighttime, compared to 22% of men. 10% choose not to go out during evenings because of feelings of unsafety, compared to 2% of men. 17% of women has refrained from an activity due to feelings of unsafety, compared to 10% of men. And 33% of women has chosen a different road or way of transportation due to feelings of unsafety, compared to 18% of men. And now we're talking on a national level, but if we look at specific neighborhoods, we can see a different pattern. So if we look at socially disadvantaged neighborhoods in Sweden, we see that 48% of women in socially disadvantaged neighborhoods feel unsafe during evenings, compared to 21% of men. So that's the perception of safety and how we perceive different places. But there are also different patterns when it comes to usage of place.
Exactly. As we can see in planning and how we use our cities as an urban planner, and we look a lot at how cities are being used, we can see that the cities and the places that we design are not always used as we want them. And in Sweden, we also have statistics that show that those places that are planned as being like places for spontaneous activities or those spontaneous sport areas are mainly dominated or mainly used by men or young men, which makes that women don't feel so attractive being there and maybe feel outruled on this place and don't feel that they can actually use these type of places. Moreover, we see that one of the main features in the urban environment, especially when we talk about the public space, the public toilets, are also mainly used up to 90%, according to our study last year in Stockholm, by just men. So women don't even feel, they might feel unsafe and they don't feel any will to even use the public toilets because of their both design, but also because of their placement, as we found out. So now we come to this webinar here, and we are broadcasting from Stockholm, but we are having participants from all over the world, from around nearly 20 countries, and we are around 40 people now joining the webinar, and that's around 2/3 of the ones that signed up. So that's a good turnout, I would say, for those digital days. So we are very happy to share this discussion with you internationally. Hope you are awake if you're on the other side of the world. If you have any questions, as we said, put them on the chat and we will try to answer them when we have time, and try to put as many of your questions, if they are directed to us or to Leslie, we will try to pick them up during our talks. In the end, there might be some time for questions. Otherwise, we will forward the leftover questions to the person and you will get them answered via mail.
So the background to this webinar was that we arranged a webinar this May about women's liberty and safety in public space. And after we had done that, I and Cornelis thought that it was interesting to share these experiences and knowledge around the world. So we thought that how can we use this in a different context? And then we thought that maybe we should start a book talk series. about feminist literature. And that's exactly what we did. And what was funny was that this coincided with a book being released, and it's called Feminicity, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, written by Leslie Kern. And that is what we will discuss today. And we are very fortunate that Leslie wanted to join us in this discussion. So Leslie, we want to say welcome to you, and maybe you can give a brief presentation of yourself and say hello to the listeners.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Marika and Cornelis for inviting me to be a part of this event, and to everyone who has arrived to be with us on the webinar today. I'm joining you from Canada, from a town called Sackville, New Brunswick, on what is the unceded territory of the Indigenous Mi'kmaq and Maliseet people, with whom we share treaties of peace and friendship here. I'm a professor of geography and environment at Mount Allison University, and as Marika mentioned, I'm the author of a relatively new book called Feminicity, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World, and I'm happy to be able to share some of that book and the ideas behind it, and to have a conversation with everyone today.
Great. And we want this webinar to be an interactive webinar, so we have prepared some polls that you, the participants, will be able to answer. And we will start off with like a practice poll for you to answer, and it is if you have read the book, so that we know if you are totally new and if you haven't heard anything about the book before, or if you have actually read it. So I will try to launch this poll, and I hope that it works. So please answer it. And now it should have appeared. So I hope it did. Yep, stuff is happening. So the question is, have you read the book Feminicity, Claiming Space in a Man-Made World? And from your replies, 30% of you, the participants, have read it, and 70% have not read it. So that's great. We have some new incomers and some who know everything about this book and are full with questions and comments about the book. So we will have more polls, but we also want to give you the opportunity to give comments and ask us questions, so you can use either the chat or the Q&A. So just send us questions and comments if they pop up in your head. And now we will begin talking about this book. And Leslie, we have told you previously that we wanted to give you an opportunity to read a piece from your book. So that's what you can do now.
Great. Yes, thank you. So, and thank you to everyone who's read the book so far. That's wonderful to hear. So I'm going to read an excerpt from the first main chapter called City of Moms, and it deals with some of the experiences that first led me to be interested in topics like feminist urban planning. So here we go. If you've ever been pregnant, the geography closest in gets really strange really fast. Suddenly, you are someone else's environment, and everything about how your body moves through the world and is perceived by others is about to change. I was pregnant with my daughter Maddie over a typically dreary London winter and through what felt like an unusually warm spring and summer. I had a part-time office job. My commute was only 5 subway stops, but most days it felt interminable. When I worked a morning shift, my nausea would force me off the train partway through the journey, where I would stumble to a bench and try to calm my stomach before gingerly reboarding a new train. Before I was visibly pregnant, there was no chance of being offered a seat, no matter how waxy and green my face. This lack of hospitality didn't improve much, even after my belly expanded. I was determined to be one of those pregnant people who carried on with their normal lives as though nothing had changed. This was long before Serena Williams won a Grand Slam tournament while pregnant, but I was channeling that kind of spirit. I was a recent women's studies graduate with my own copy of Our Bodies, Ourselves. I was prepared to be fierce and stick to my feminist principles in the face of the pathologizing medical profession. But I wasn't at all prepared for the way that my place in the city was changing. I hadn't yet heard of feminist geography, but I was certainly a feminist, and my feminist self was bristling at every turn. My body had suddenly turned into public property, available for touching or comment. My body was a big inconvenience to others, and they didn't mind letting me know. My body's new shape had taken away my sense of anonymity and invisibility in the city. I could no longer blend in, become part of the crowd, or people watch. I was the one being watched. I didn't know how much I valued these things until they were gone. They didn't magically reappear after my daughter was born either. Pregnancy and motherhood made the gendered city visible to me in high definition. I had rarely been so aware of my embodiment. While I had experienced street harassment and fear, I had little sense of how deep, how systemic, and how geographical it all was. As a woman, a complete sense of anonymity or invisibility in the city had never fully existed for me. The constant anticipation of harassment or ogling eyes meant that any ability to glide along as one of the crowd was always fleeting. Nonetheless, privileges such as white skin and able-bodiedness gave me some measure of invisibility. Blending seamlessly into the urban crowd, freely traversing the streets, and engaging in detached but appreciative spectatorship have long been held up as true urban ideals since the explosive growth of the industrial city. I'm thinking about the idea of the flaneur. But it's impossible to blend in when your body has suddenly become public property. Although women often experience comments on our bodies and uninvited physical contact, pregnancy and motherhood elevate these intrusions to a new level. People read my protruding belly as if it said, "Rub here, please." Perhaps ironically, strangers' fascination with my body didn't translate into much of an uptick in urban courtesy. In fact, I sensed a constant low-grade reminder that I was now different, other, and out of place. This was most obvious to me on the subway, where I was rarely offered a seat during my rush hour commute. Posh businessmen deliberately buried their faces in the broadsheet newspapers, pretending not to see me. One time, I relinquished my seat to an even more pregnant woman before anyone took notice of either of us. People who've been pregnant share these sorts of stories with a wry chuckle, like old war stories, as if they're just rites of passage when you're pregnant in the city, as if it's all to be expected for daring to leave your home with your messy, inconvenient body. This level of rudeness didn't happen every day, but underlying all of this kind of social hostility was the fact that the city itself, its very form and function, seemed set up to make my life shockingly difficult. I was accustomed to being aware of my environment in terms of safety, which had a lot more to do with who was in the environment rather than the environment itself. Now, however, the city was out to get me. Barriers that my able-bodied, youthful self had never encountered were suddenly slamming into me at every turn. The freedom that the city had once represented seemed like a distant memory. I quickly realized that using public transit with a baby stroller in London was a joke. Although a lot of subway stations have elevators because the stations are so deep underground, only 50 out of 270 stations are accessible. Curved staircases, random steps, steep escalators, sharp turns, narrow tunnels, and of course thousands of commuters and tourists make navigating the system truly an adventure. Every aspect of public transit reminded me that I was not the ideal imagined users. Stairs, revolving doors, turnstiles, no space for strollers, broken elevators and escalators, rude comments, glares, all of these told me that the city was not designed with parents and children in mind. I sheepishly realized that until I faced these barriers, I had rarely considered the experiences of disabled people or seniors who are even more poorly accommodated. It's almost as though we're all presumed to want or need no access to work, public space, or city services. Best to remain in our homes and institutions where we belong. Thank you. That's the end of my excerpt for today.
Thank you so much, Leslie. That was lovely to hear it being written and being read also. You are writing a lot or talking a lot about your own experiences. You have put a lot of anecdotes in your book. So we were talking a bit before also about why you wrote this book, but you were writing a lot about situations that you have felt vulnerable yourself. You have been arrested at the time during your protest. So you have really explained from your own experience how the city or how the environment has affected you in trying to be a part of the city, being a part of society, or trying to take place during certain protests or certain events. How would you say that actually this perspective and your experiences has actually shaped the book in its current form, or how has it contributed in you writing the book in the first place? How important has it been?
Thanks for that question. It's been very important, and I think I'm following in a long-standing feminist tradition of trying to start from the everyday experience, trying to start from women's own lives, and while recognizing that my life is not the same as every woman's, and indeed I do have many privileges in many situations, that when I start from what I know, what I've seen and lived, it can open up a different set of questions, because as I'm sure we'll talk about throughout this webinar, often women's day-to-day experiences of city life have not been well considered by city planners and politicians and designers and architects and so on. So for me, starting from that place was also an entry point to kind of invite people into the conversation in a way that they might be able to say, oh yeah, that's happened to me, or even just to look around and say, oh, I never noticed that somebody pushing a baby carriage probably can't get on this bus, and what does that mean for that person's life? So maybe allowing people to see the city in different sorts of ways by connecting it to people's real everyday lived experiences.
And I agree a lot with Cornelis, and I think that you describe these different social roles that women can have in a very good way, and I think that it's very relatable, and I think that a lot of women can relate to it. So some of these roles are how motherhood can affect women's part in the city. You're also writing about the importance of friendships, female friendships, which is a very nice chapter. So if we look at the planning process, what do we need to do? What can we change to make sure that these perspectives are taken care of in the planning process to make a difference?
Yes, so there's probably many layers to this. One would probably be an educational layer where planners go, at least here in North America, they have a master's degree in planning and that's their professional training. But for many of them, conversations about social differences, whether they're about gender, race, class, are not a mainstream part of the curriculum. That would have to be something that you would seek out on your own because you were interested in it. So maybe there's an educational piece right from the beginning. What are planners taught to notice, to think about, to care about, and to prioritize? And then once we're in the process itself, I think one of the things, and thank you for sharing some of your data earlier, because I think this illustrates this point, is that often the kind of information that's gathered about how people use the city has not been broken down by gender or sex differences. So we don't even often know that there's a difference. And at the same time, sometimes we only have quantitative data, so we have numbers, and that is useful in certain ways, but it doesn't always tell us why. So we can share numbers like a certain percentage of women don't want to go out in their neighborhoods at night, but why? So we also have to ask questions, we have to speak to people and really listen to their experiences. And again, in planning, that's seen as kind of messy, right? You're getting into like the realm of emotions and feelings and, different sorts of experiences. And it's not that easy to translate that then to like a street layout or a new housing development. So there can be a bit of a disconnect in the way that planning typically thinks in a kind of objective, rational, what's the most efficient way to do something? What's cost effective? What will generate profit? Instead of questions about how will people feel in this space, which is much more subjective and again, kind of messy. So part of the answer is that planning in some cases might need to slow down and really like listen and try to take those things into account. But part of it is just also being really aware of like who we're listening to and whose voices are seen to count or to be considered really legitimate in the discourse about cities.
Yeah, and so I think that what you're saying is that we need also to be flexible and to adjust ourselves to different local contexts and listen to the people in a local context. And we have a question from the listeners on this theme. And it is that the person is asking, what role do art and culture play in the creation of a feminist city?
This is something I've been thinking a lot about, especially in the context over the summer where we saw kind of globally a resurgence of Black Lives Matter movements. And one of the many things that they talked about and were promoting was kind of a removal of monuments, for example, to colonizers, to slave owners, to Confederate soldiers in the United States. And so when we think about our public space as a space that also tells a story, right, that represents a history, that represents ideas about who matters and so on, art can play a key role in that. But we have to think about, again, like what stories are being told through that art. Who are the artists? What is being represented? Who is being shown to be valued, and what kinds of stories are being told? So in the North American context, we're seeing a resurgence of like Indigenous place naming, art and imagery and symbolism in urban spaces, which is important, I think, for reminding us that we are still on colonized lands where Indigenous people still live. If you Google something like statues of women, if you just Google that, you'll find that around the world, there's very few statues of real women, like actually existing historical figures or current figures. There's a lot of statues of just naked women's bodies all over the place as like art, but not a lot of statues that tell a story about women's history. So I think art has a role to play in that because it tells us something about like who belongs and who matters in a space.
And you're also writing very interestingly about different rape myths and how rape myths are being used to control women's liberty in public space. So you're writing that these sexist myths serve to remind us that we are expected to limit our freedom to walk, work, have fun, and take up space in the city. They say the city isn't really for you. And you're also emphasizing and talking about Koskela's research about the bold woman and the importance of bold women. And that also we need bold women who go out in public space and claim the space. And I think that we need to balance when we're looking at those two perspectives, because yes, we need the bold women, but we can't put the responsibility of claiming the space on the women either. So what's your reflections on that, and what measures can we use to include women in a positive way?
Yes, thanks for that. I think it's important to recognize that even though women do express a fairly high levels of fear of crime, that nonetheless, most women do go out every day and go to work. They do have lives in the city. They do claim space. And it's not always that they wake up in the morning and go, I'm going to be bold today. It's that I have to go to my job. I have to get on the subway. I have to, walk through this neighborhood that doesn't feel safe, or, this is just my day-to-day life. So I think in many ways, it's about recognizing that most women every day are being bold because the messages that we get placed on us are that we should be afraid all the time. So just to like go about your daily life is kind of an act of boldness. But you're right that it's not all about like encouraging women to be more brave. It's also about, I think, changing that conversation to recognize that a lot of the fear is not because of actual violence, but it's that we are told that we should be fearful, and that is a kind of social control that reminds women that we don't really belong in public spaces, that we should be, attending to the home, that the kitchen is our place, those sorts of messages. So fear is kind of tied up in those traditional gender roles as well, as a way of maintaining that status quo.
Yes. So we will change the subject a little bit. So this May, we arranged a webinar with a lot of different speakers, and some of the experts talked about COVID-19 and what it would mean for women specifically. So you can say that they tried to look into the future and what COVID-19 would mean for women, but now we have had it and we have lived with it for a longer time. So we will talk shortly about COVID-19, and now we will have a poll for you who listens. So the next question that we want you to answer is this question. Has COVID-19 affected women and men differently in your city or country? So please answer that question. All right, stuff is happening. Okay, I think that we can. Okay, now we're reaching the limit. So 66% of all of you say that yes, COVID-19 has affected women and men differently. 3% say no, and 31% say I don't know. So we want to hear Leslie's reflections on this question, but if you also want to comment on this question and tell us what you mean when you say that it has affected women and men differently, or what hasn't happened, you can write it in a comment and we can share those experiences together. So Leslie, what's your answer to this question?
Well, my answer is definitely yes. So here in Canada, we've seen many of the same things that people have been talking about globally. We've seen a rise in calls for assistance in terms of domestic violence. So, you know, putting people into a lockdown situation is a reminder that the home is not always a safe space, especially for women and children. We've also seen that many of the job sectors that have been hard hit by economic shutdowns have been areas where a lot of women work. So restaurants, hospitality, hotels, tourism. So a lot more women have lost their work. And that the kind of shutdown of childcare and schools for a long time, and now kids are back in school, but of course, kids get sent home all the time because they have a runny nose and they need a COVID test. So many women have found that they are doing a disproportionate share of the childcare, the homeschooling, all the extra work that it takes to keep a house clean and running smoothly when everybody's working from home. Like, it's just a lot of extra work. So there's a suggestion that you know, some in North America, like hundreds of thousands of women have left the workforce. And just this week, the Canadian government signaled that they are finally maybe almost going to come up with a national childcare program, with the rationale that if we don't bring women back to work in the economy, there will be no economic recovery post-COVID. So I think these are probably similar trends, but I would also be interested to hear what people from other places have to say about that.
Yeah, we have one participant connecting this to public transport, saying that it's mostly women who use public transportation, and women have to use public transportation to go to work, etc. And baby won't be able to work from home.
Yes, for sure. I mean, just in general times, in most places, women have less access to a private vehicle. Which, you know, of course, is a sort of a safer, COVID-wise, a safer way to travel than public transportation, although not safer in terms of accidents. But yes, more women, especially if you work in a so-called essential service, like healthcare or something, then you're going to be taking public transportation and maybe exposing yourself to more risk in that way as well.
I also think that something that you frame very nicely in your book, since I and Cornelis work more problem-oriented, we try to deal with specific problems. But you are lifting public space in a very positive way, emphasizing what a public space can mean for women. So when I think about COVID-19, also think about the loss of public space, this free zone where women can walk to get away from home and responsibilities. We also have another comment from participants, and she says that from what I can see, the job sector of municipal elderly care in Sweden have been especially hard hit and at risk for COVID-19. A job sector where a majority of employees are women. In Sweden, schools have not been shut down, thankfully, for many of the reasons Leslie's mentioned.
Yes, I think it may be the same in Sweden. A lot of the women who work in like elderly care homes and in healthcare in terms of doing things like cleaning and food service are also immigrants, right? And racial minority women and men. And so that's another factor in this as well, that there is another kind of intersecting difference that is affecting people's risks in these sectors as well. And they're not very well paid jobs, many of them. So they're doing this very risky labor for relatively poor pay.
I think if we go further here, we have some on the Q&A part also some reflections there about feeling safe in the public space or in the city or not. One who lived both in Sweden and in Canada, Toronto, and experiencing that, for instance, childless women was socially more accepted than in Sweden, or at least in places outside. Perhaps she rather experienced the opposite as you described, actually. But that might have been also part of the context or the different society groups which are present in the place. Do you have any reflections on how that affects your own perception? And also maybe now connected to the COVID situation where there are obviously less people in the public space, and how that then affects women's perception of the public space and their will to use the public space.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a bit, I live in a very small town right now where my university is. So I don't have during the pandemic, I haven't had that direct experience of what it's like to be in a city that's under lockdown, because in a small town, life looks kind of the same that it does in a normal time, where it's very quiet and there's not tons of people on the street. So just in thinking about what I've been hearing, or that, yes, I mean, one of the things that tends to make women feel safer is when there are lots of people in public space. So a situation where suddenly there are fewer people on the streets could increase a sense of danger. I do worry, kind of as Marika mentioned, like if we're in a moment where people kind of aren't in public space and so many women are feeling overburdened at home, and maybe we're going to stay in a work from home situation for a long time, maybe even after COVID, as companies say, oh, maybe you can just work from home. What does that mean for our perception of who is part of our community, right? If we're all kind of shut away in our homes and we're not even in the somewhat public space of work, I wonder about what that kind of means for like women's economic participation, women's sense of being a part of a bigger community, women's sense of like isolation, because yes, I mean, part of what the public realm of the city offers is at least a momentary escape from the, the care work of being in the home, and even going to your workplace can, for many women, at least when I experienced this, when my daughter was very little, I went back to school, to graduate school. And even though it was very hard to study and have a baby at home, I loved being out at school and using my brain and being an adult with other adults and having smart intellectual conversations, and not having, a tiny being like clawing at you and needing all of this care and attention at every moment. So I do worry that, if we're all kind of like, oh, just work from home forever, that doesn't maybe provide us with the full kind of community connections and intellectual stimulation that I think we all need, not just women.
Mm. Yeah, even as a man, I can quite relate to that, I would say.
Speaking of men, so one of our challenges when we're talking about feminist urban planning is to include men, make men understand, and to use concrete examples and see this as inspiration and broaden the perspectives. So one factor that we see is successful when including men is to talk about feminist perspectives as something that contributes to both women and men, because it doesn't only it's not only good for women. So from your perspective, what does a feminist city mean for men?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I do strongly believe that all of the kinds of principles and practices that we might put in place in the name of feminism, none of those take anything away from men, and in many ways would benefit men. I mean, even issues of safety, I think we know that even though men express or report less fear, in public spaces, men are more likely to be victims of crime or to experience violence. So creating safer cities is not just about making women feel better or be safer, but actually would probably benefit men's lives more, since they are technically more likely to have that experience in public space. It also, you know, men in many places are taking on more active childcare roles and are perhaps experiencing some of those barriers that I described in my reading, where trying to move through the city with children is very difficult. We know many men's washrooms don't have space to change a baby's diaper, for example. They don't have a change table or space in them to do that. So men out in public space with their children are sometimes in this difficult position of not, or if they have young, like female children that need to use a girl's washroom, they can't go in with them. And so all of these little elements of how spaces are gendered are kind of limiting to men as well. And I think more generally, we have to recognize that not all men are able-bodied, for example. There are lots of disabled men, elderly men, men who experience racial discrimination and class discrimination, and measures such as physical accessibility, greater affordability in urban space, these things that are important for women, could also help a huge group of men as well.
So you would summarize it a bit that a feminist city would basically benefit all societal groups?
I think so. I mean, I suppose for the sort of the people who are at the very highest levels, the ones who sort of rely on, you know, having somebody at home to do all of that domestic work. I mean, there are certain kinds of maybe changes to the status quo that can be a little bit uncomfortable for people. But I think in the long run, we all benefit when we lift up either, you know, groups that don't look like us in society. I think we lift everybody.
Earlier on, we had one question from the audience also, which is connected to this, or a bit more specific, basically, like what would a feminist city look like for young women living in marginalized areas or parts of the city?
That's a great question, and I've found in you know in what I've explored that often young women and girls are very left out of urban planning. They're not really considered to be kind of a stakeholder group. So often young men, like adolescent men, are considered in part because they're seen to be a potential problem, right? Like you have to give them like a football field or basketball court or something, because otherwise they'll loiter and they'll get into trouble or they'll join a gang or something. So you have to give them a space to use that's like fun and productive. But we don't think that way about young women. We don't think, what urban spaces would girls and women need? And so I think that is also a question for especially for disadvantaged communities where without a lot of disposable income to go and, for example, shop or sit in a cafe to socialize, what spaces are available. So some of the research that people have found is that when women are in public space with one another and girls, they like spaces where they can sit and see each other and talk. They also want spaces to play, but that can be difficult because you kind of have to negotiate around the boys who are very good at claiming space. But a lot of urban areas, we have benches that are kind of all in a line, and they're not really set up to be like cozy talking spaces. So thinking about ways that you can encourage spaces for conversation amongst young women, for women who might be mothers, like young mothers, you also need to make sure that they can have places for children to play. And issues like public toilets are very important for that as well, because people aren't going to spend a lot of time outdoors in public space if there's nowhere to use a bathroom.
Before we go on to the next poll, we also have a reflection on the topic of COVID-19 that I thought would be nice to say. And it's a participant that says that, isn't it possible that COVID-19 and people working from home has increased gender equality as well, with men taking more responsibility for the unpaid labor at home?
Yes, and so I was recently reading an article based from the United States that was saying that, yes, in many cases, men's share of household labor has been going up. It's still not equal to women's, but it has been going up. So I think in an optimistic vein, we might be seeing a moment where men are able to actually see all of the domestic labor that happens at home, that where they are understanding the value and getting a lot of pleasure out of being with their children more than they normally would be, and having those like day-to-day momentary kind of intimate experiences of care and seeing their children grow and change. So I think that is a hopeful moment, and the article that I was reading was very optimistic that this might be a moment where like that really persistent gap that has clung on even in places like Sweden, which is one of the most gender equal places. There's still a little bit of a gap in terms of who does the greater share of work in the home. Maybe that will start to close.
We are going on to the last poll, and this is something that we haven't really discussed within the Network for Feminist Urban Planning. We seldom talk about female leadership. We talk more on a lower level, but we were curious on what everybody thinks about this statement. So please answer this statement, that is, a feminist city is a matriarchal city. We are very curious on what you think on this.
You're having fun there, Marika.
Answers are incoming.
We have some few in the chat. We have some few examples also from places where they worked with young women or kids. So we can maybe, if we manage in the end, try to highlight them a bit.
So you have different opinions on this statement. We have 28 people who has answered, 29. So 7% of you strongly disagree to the statement, a feminist city is a matriarchal city. 60% of you disagree, 10% of you are neutral, 13% agree, and 10% strongly agree. So different opinions. And if you want to comment on this statement, feel free to do it in the chat, and we will talk about your reflections. But Leslie, what do you think? What's your position on this statement?
So that was a great question. I hadn't quite thought in those terms before. I chose agree, not so much in the sense of thinking about that the city kind of has to be led only by women or specifically by women, but more with the idea that in a matriarchal culture, things like care labor would be valued work, right? That they wouldn't be seen as something that is stigmatized or needs to be unpaid or underpaid or low skilled. Like that would be a priority. And that's one of the things I've been talking a lot about in various webinars and seminars, and I think COVID-19 has really shown as well, is that we can't have this thing called the economy without people and without the care that keeps people alive and fed and clean and healthy. And so much of that work has typically fallen to women. So in thinking what would matriarchy look like in a city, for me, it would mean that the city actually prioritizes making sure that care labor can happen, not just so that women can do it more easily, but so that it's spread throughout the city and throughout society.
But wouldn't we forget parts that are closely connected to masculinity if we do that? Should we really go to the other extreme?
Yeah, again, to me, it's not so much about what would be attributes of masculinity or femininity, but more about how can we create a society where all of the different types of work and contributions that people offer, some of which have been kind of forced into a binary category of gender, are seen as valuable. I think it's also true that there are some aspects of masculinity that need reevaluating, which is not to kind of throw men under the bus, but to say to men, like, actually, there are a lot of other ways of being men that currently you're kind of not allowed to do, because masculinity says you have to act like this and look like this, behave this way, believe these things, that if you kind of loosened that up, men would experience a lot more freedom to be who they really want to be without being stuck into a narrowly defined gender box as well.
Connected to that also, I guess you're also aiming to, and what you write about in your book, like, because your book is a lot about giving more knowledge or getting out the message about feminist urban planning. Do you see it also as a tool to more or less teach men in leading positions to learn how to manage a city from a feminist perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think we're seeing a lot of ideas kind of bubbling up in cities that are quite similar to things that women and feminists have been saying for a long time. So for example, the idea of the 15-minute city that some places are talking about, like the mayor of Paris was speaking about this recently. Well, this is something that feminists have long said, oh, this is why cities can be really good for women, because in the suburbs, for example, there's long distances to travel, things are very separated, you're isolated, there's not a lot of services or access to employment, and so being kind of stuck in the home, the suburbs facilitate that. But city life, you're close to work, to schools, to social services, healthcare, green space, consumption, everything that you need can be closer by. And so the idea of the 15-minute city is making that even more accessible. And so that could mean that people, not just women, can balance those aspects of home and work and family and social life in much easier ways. So I think when we start to include that women's perspective, a feminist perspective, then we can come up with ideas for cities that really change the way that everybody lives in them, hopefully for the better.
Just that. So yeah, 15 minutes or 20-minute cities, they are becoming popular. How do you then connect this feministic perspective to the countryside, where you have longer distances, where functions and places are more spread out and population is not so dense, it's rather sparsely populated?
Yeah, that is a good question. And my experience now living for 10 years or so in a rural area, I live in a town of 5,000 people in a very rural province overall. There's no public transportation. So issues like transport are a huge concern, because people can, if you don't have a car or you can't drive for some reason, then you can be quite isolated. In a small town, there's less anonymity, right? Which is something that a lot of people, including women, really value about urban life, is that sort of a more freedom to be yourself and to be amongst strangers. And that doesn't really happen here. So it's, but at the same time, I think some of these ideas about, like, again, how do we collectivize care work? How do we make our towns, even our small towns, places where more vulnerable groups in in our communities can have access to things like healthy, fresh food, or again, like childcare spaces, or even some notion of public space. But I agree, I mean, it's much more challenging for lots of kind of social, economic, and spatial reasons.
And we also have a reflection on the question of the matriarchal city. And that is our participant saying that I think that feminism is a critical perspective that strengthens the building of a society for all. However, have a female class of rulers does not in itself guarantee an intersectional perspective that brings forth various perspectives. For example, the leadership at my job is female, but they do not necessarily have a critical perspective, but adhere to the patriarchal rules, norms, and values.
Yeah, great point. Totally agree with that. Women leaders are not inherently feminist, but research does show that, especially at the municipal level, like the city level, that when there are more women, for example, who are like city councilors or, you know, elected leaders in cities, that issues that have typically been deemed women's issues, like childcare, safety, those sorts of questions are more likely to receive time and attention at city council. So there is something about maybe there being like a critical mass of women that might start to shift certain conversations that would often be left off the table.
Okay, we're starting to run out of time here for this short webinar, which is good. The time is running away. We're having fun. We would like to ask you one last question, which a few participants also asked us. Could you describe what is a typical feminist city and give some specific examples, for instance, on what to think about when you plan specific places? You already mentioned benches, for instance, for women to sit and talk and look at others, but any other few points? What does a typical feminist city look like?
Thanks for that question. And I wish I could say, look at this one city and it would be a shining example, but I don't know that that city exists yet. But some of the things that we could point to that are really important. So housing and affordable housing are very key issues. So wherever we can look to increase the supply of affordable housing, keep rent and the cost of housing low or subsidize that, then that is a key factor. Having a really good widespread network of public transportation is also key. In most cities, public transport is maximized to take someone from home to work in a kind of linear journey. But for many women and for anyone engaged in other types of care work or family or elder care responsibilities, your journeys are much more complicated. They're not linear. There's lots of stops. So having again, widespread network of public transportation that is affordable, that is physically accessible, and that runs at different times of the day and so on is really important. I think having some kind of safety plan is key, but we do have to kind of look beyond policing as a way of ensuring community safety. So thinking about safety from the ground up, what gives everybody the most security and safety. So again, having a home, having employment, having a stable income, having mental health services and healthcare services. These are the things that create a stable society such that we prevent crime before people are driven to crime, right? So thinking about, you know, what serves those needs. And finally, I guess I would say, you know, an idea of a feminist city is one that really does value that care labor, and there's different ways to show that. It could be that that your city implements a kind of a living wage bylaw where the minimum wage is higher than a national standard because many women do work in minimum wage, low wage jobs. So raising wages, trying to close the wage gap is really key there. And also just ways of thinking about how do we collectivize care labor? How do we offer good childcare? How do we, you know, encourage men to take up more of that labor? There are things that cities can do to encourage that. So those are some of the things that I would point to.
Thank you. A very concrete answer. The time is running out. So we have reached the end of this webinar, or the first episode of this book talk series. So we are very happy that the first author that we could invite was you, Leslie. So thank you that you could participate during this book talk. We also hope that you who have listened, that you have enjoyed the book talk and that you want to have this kind of webinar with us again. And if you have any ideas or thoughts on literature that you would find interesting, you can give us a tip and email us on that as well. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great
When is
conversation.
your next book coming, Leslie?
Hopefully soon. I'm writing a book about gentrification, but still talking a lot about feminist cities. So I have to find time to plug away at the new one as well.
Great. Then we see you then when that is finished.
We're waiting eagerly.
Maybe I will even be able to come to Sweden and speak with you in person.
That would be great.